Hi there, and welcome to Central Texas Gardener. I'm Tom Spencer. You know, I count on foliar color and texture for garden strength, no matter what's in bloom. For Robert Beyer, variegated plants have become one of his passions to create garden dimension. Today, he shows off some of his favorites. On tour, we visit the garden that he and his wife Lana turned into their latest botanical exploration.
I'm going to pat the soil down firmly, and for those of you that think you don't have a green thumb, this is the color it needs to be. That's real gardening.
Master gardener Robert Beyer has been in love with plants forever. When he and his wife Lana moved from Houston to Austin in 2006, Bob welcomed this brand new domain of botanical exploration.
Just the fun of collecting and finding new and different things, and somehow finding a place to put them in the garden without making the garden look completely out of kilter. I call the backyard a mini botanical garden.
In front, Robert goes for a profile that works for the neighborhood, but adventures beyond the usual cast of characters. It's in back that he constantly experiments with its microclimates. Though mostly in sun for now, he takes advantage of what shade he gets. In each area, he wants to encounter a distinct botanical revelation. Since wildlife is important too, they garden organically and design niches for secretive residents.
That's how we design different areas, so that there's a certain flow as you walk around the garden, and each is almost like a little surprise area.
For Lana, it can be a surprise every day, since Bob's garden can change overnight when a plant grabs his attention.
It's like the thrill of the hunt, you know, always trying to find something a little different, you know, that someone else might not have, that I can enjoy in the yard. It's not an ego thing, it's just the excitement of finding something that's new and different. Maybe a plant in a miniature form or an unusual growth form, a very unusual coloration to it. It may be a cultivar of a very commonly known species.
Lana puts it all into perspective.
Basically, when you have one of everything, it's hard to find combinations of plants that look well together, and that's where I depend on Lana a great deal. She has a real eye for design, and I'm just terrible at it. So I have the knowledge of the plants and how big they're going to grow and what to expect from them, and I share that with her, and she helps me put them in some sort of fashion where you can take a collection of one of each type of plant and make it look like it blends together, or it is homogenized.
He's being a little bit modest. He loves to show off his yard, and I love to meet people. So he attracts them, and then I get to talk with them.
Lana also spends part of her free time knitting for Threads of Love. But she has her own spot in the garden too. Bob likes her seasonal color just fine, though his passion now heads in another direction.
40% of the plants that I grow are variegated because I like different unusual cultivars and varieties of plants. I like to see a lot of color in the yard when things are not in bloom. Most plants go through a blooming cycle. Once the blooms are gone, there's not much to look at. I want to see something to look at even in the dead of winter.
Bob's been quick to adapt from his Houston ways.
I'm not a glutton for punishment. I won't put in plants that I'm going to have a really, really difficult time trying to grow. I try to grow plants that are adaptive to this area. And if you'll notice, the lawn is looking terrible right now because of the drought that we've had. We just didn't feel that we could justify wasting water on maintaining a beautiful green lawn.
But it's good enough for active grandkids that don't have to worry about where they run. From their deck, Lana and Bob can keep an eye on them and the garden.
I like to be able to look out and enjoy the fruits of his labors.
Of course, Bob found the perfect microclimate on the deck for experiments in containers. One of them is his mini pond for lilies that bloom in season. Bob waters container plants from his rain barrel to reduce mineral residue in the pots. To overwinter tender plants, he installed his latest greenhouse against the house. Mainly, it's where he starts new ones to share with other gardeners or to propagate cuttings when he can't protect a tropical through frost.
For example, if a shrub, a tropical plant gets too large, I can propagate a cutting of it and keep the cutting for next year. And I like downsize my plants continually to keep them small enough to fit in the very limited garden space that I have.
When Bob's not in the garden, he's on the computer. Along with his website, where he details plant information, he blogs about his latest endeavors.
It's sharing your love for gardening and for horticulture with others in a way in which you're not expecting anything in return. You know, it's non-commercial. It's attempted. I'm trying to use the knowledge that I've gained from being a master gardener, from having a degree in horticulture, and from studying plants myself. I want to share that with others, and I think that's a great way to do so.
Bob's also volunteered his talents to Zilker Botanical Gardens newsletter. His camera has become as vital to his gardening gear as his pruners and shovel.
But when I stroll through the garden and I see what I've got here, believe it or not, I start thinking, what can I do next year?
He loves to dig. He won't wear gloves. He loves to get his hands in the dirt, and he loves to dig, and he loves to move things around. And so that's where I'll step in sometimes when he gets a little carried away with that. He killed a sage, which are hard to kill because he moved it too many times in one growing season. But he does love to dig. He is happiest when I think he's a true gardener in that sense. He's happiest when he's got his hands in the dirt.
Stick it in there. Got it down firm, and I'll give it some root stimulator in just a little while. I think of what's this garden going to look like next year. I'm always thinking ahead because I know it's going to change. The way the garden looks this year is very different from the way it looked last year and the year before that, and it'll look different again next year.
Well, from the garden to the gardener, we're now joined in the studios by Robert Beyer. And Robert, it's a pleasure to have you on Central Texas Gardener. Thanks for sharing your garden with us.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here.
Well, we're going to be talking about variegated plants, which is a personal passion of yours, and I want to get started by learning about how that came to be. Variegation, when we say variegation, let's just let people know, what exactly do we mean? We have a little example of that right here.
Well, a variegated plant is any plant that has two or more colors, or one or more colors that are different from the natural color of the plant. Mm-hmm. And in other words, a variety in the color.
Okay, so just really foliage patterns and colors really is what we're talking about.
That's correct, that's right. A lot of people refer to variegation in terms of flowers, but we're talking strictly foliage.
Right, and I understand the passion for it. I think when I first started gardening, I really was fascinated by all the variations that could exist of a single plant, courtesy of variegation. It really adds some spice in the garden. And you like to use these plants in the garden because they really provide year-round interest, don't they?
Yes, they certainly do. In fact, of over 400 plants that I grow, 40% of them are variegated. Mm-hmm. So that's an indication of how much I really do like them. But I use variegated plants to add additional color to the garden because a lot of times I love blooming plants and flowers, but they have a finite period in which they're blooming, and then the rest of the year, what are you looking at? I want color in the garden year-round. And I try to incorporate variegated plants to add that different color, the different texture, and sort of paint a picture with it.
I bet that sometimes people come to your yard and are just confused by all the variegated foliage. You know, I mean, they're used to seeing green plants, and all of a sudden here's a garden filled with all these brightly colored leaves. That must be a little disorienting sometimes.
It's strange, Tom. A lot of people feel that their plants are sick if they see a variegated plant. That's not the case at all. I look at it in terms of providing striking contrast and color. Right,
right. Well, I want to let people know real briefly that you also have a passion for gardening that you share online too.
Yes, about over 15 years ago, I started a website. It started out as Houston and Gulf Coast Gardening, and when we moved to Austin 3 years ago, I immediately had to change that the name, and I call it Southeast Texas Gardening because it now covers Central Texas as well.
Okay, Southeast Gardening info.
SoutheastTexasGardening.info.
Okay, very good,
Okay.
very good. Well, let's dive in and talk about some of these different
Sure.
plants that you brought. I was just holding up this little guy, and this is a form of Asiatic jasmine, which is very common, but you don't see this variant very often.
No, this is a new introduction. It's been out in just the past couple of years. It's called salsa. It has a real spicy color, combination of colors to it, predominantly yellow and green, and when the new growth comes out, it adds a vivid orange color as well.
Yeah, very attractive.
Can you imagine that as a ground cover underneath your solid green plants? What a color boost that gives to the garden.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And this is a good hardy plant, obviously. Asiatic jasmine
Yes, it certainly is.
A good ground cover and for sun or shade, really.
That's correct.
Yeah, so that's a terrific thing. Now, what we have here is a plant called Dianella. It's also called flax flower.
Tasmanian flax.
Right. And it is there are several forms of this on the market. I have to say the only one I like is the variegated form. I really like this plant. Now tell us what kind of conditions this one grows in.
That plant, a lot of people thought that this would not be hardy in this area, but it's proven itself to be very hardy in the winter garden. This plant survived outdoors in my garden, and all I had to do is maybe trim off a little dead growth, and it's looking just fine again. It took the ice storm, it took everything. It's quite a nice evergreen addition to your garden that provides a very striking color as well.
And grows in the shade too, right?
Yes, it does. Very, very much so.
Yeah, and so when you get that bold striping in the shady situation, it really stands out.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's a great plant. Now, you have a lot of variegated citrus in your garden, don't you?
Yes, I do.
And this is a beautiful little, you brought this little cutting in. You can see it has variegated foliage, but also variegated fruit. And I don't know if our cameras are going to pick that up, but that's charming.
Yes, it is. Yellow streaked among the green on the fruit, and then when the fruit matures, it turns to just a solid orange. That's a variegated Calamundan orange.
Calamundan orange.
Calamundan orange, right. And it is cold hardy down to 25 degrees. During this winter, my plant has suffered no damage whatsoever, including ice and sub-freezing temperatures.
So you could grow it in a container and just shelter it if you need to, or in the ground in a sheltered location and cover it if you need to. Yeah. Well, it is a beautiful little plant. I have a variegated lemon that I'm really fond of in my garden.
Not only that, you get the fragrance of citrus blossoms as well.
Yeah, there's nothing like that, right? Now, here's an old favorite from a lot of gardeners is Elaeagnus, which is a big, vigorous shrub that's used in a lot of different situations. And this tells a story about variegation too. This is an Elaeagnus, but there's a difference between this and the parent plant.
That's correct. Most people shy away from growing Elaeagnus because it grows so rampantly. It grows very fast, and it becomes a maintenance problem requiring constant pruning. Where the variegated plants produce much less chlorophyll, therefore they are much slower growing. And this particular plant, for example, is about 50% variegated, would grow at a much slower rate, and this particular shrub requires maybe once or twice a light trimming during the year, but it's very easy to maintain. Plus it adds beautiful evergreen color through the winter when most everything else is dormant.
And that's a really striking variegation. I think that's a beautiful example of kind of the art of variegation, if you will.
Yes. There are about 3 different variegations of, there are other variegated varieties of Elaeagnus, but this particular one is one of my favorites.
I always love the bloom fragrance of Elaeagnus too. It's one of my favorite flower scents. Now, there are variegated agaves, variegated yuccas, and this is a little agave, right?
That's correct.
Yeah, beautiful form.
Agave lopantha, and I've seen it under different names, variegata, quadricolor, call different things. But this particular plant started out, the species plant has a light green streak down the middle, and then all of a sudden one day somebody discovered a sport or mutation that occurred that had nice variegated margins, and this plant has been making the rounds among gardens.
Yeah, I have a form of Lophantha that is blue, which is really beautiful.
Oh, that must be nice. Yes, indeed.
This is with stripes as well, so blue and blue-green and kind of a gray-green. It's really attractive.
One thing that's nice about this is it stays nice and small, too.
Yeah, the other one does not. It is a monster. It will take over the garden. But this is a very attractive little plant here. Now, we have some images of some of the yuccas, which is another family that a lot of variegation work has been done in.
Oh, there's some beautiful variegated yuccas, especially the yuccas. I'm talking about some that aren't really full of spines and thorns, whatever. Yucca filamentosa, there's about 3 or 4 striking different variegated forms of that I've seen in the local nursery trade.
And you have a favorite form of that, don't you? Margaritaville, is that what I've heard?
That's Yucca rotundifolia.
Oh, rotundifolia.
Yeah,
okay.
right. It's a different species, but yes, that is a favorite because it is just streaked with color. I mean, it just doesn't have one color pattern to it. It's just like somebody took a paintbrush and just painted down the
beautiful.
leaf. It's really quite beautiful, yes.
Okay, and you were talking about the filamentosa. That's another group that been a lot of experimentation
That's
with.
another species. There's varieties called Bright Edge, Golden Sword, Old Gold.
Very popular, and I see them in a lot of gardening catalogs these days, and very, very attractive plants. And these are not the real stiff yuccas. These are
very
plants
flexible,
that are very flexible and easy to garden around as well. Well, it's easy to see why you're so passionate about these plants, and it's great that you're sharing your passion. And again, tell people about your website real briefly.
Okay, it's Southeast Texas Gardening. It's www.southeasttexasgardening, all one word, .info. And it's a completely public information, non-commercial type of site where I just try to share gardening tips and information with others.
Well, and we really do appreciate you coming on. I think this is the first time we've ever had in the history of this program a discussion just on variegated plants. So it's a lot of fun, something fresh and new for us, and we appreciate your enthusiasm for this topic as well as coming on the show. And thanks again for sharing your garden with us. Okay, it's a real pleasure. Coming up next, it's Skip Richter.
Hello and welcome to Down to Earth. You've probably driven around town and noticed all the beautiful roses blooming this time of the year. April is Rose Month in Central Texas, and they just look great. You may want to know, how do I have roses like that at home? And that's our question of the week this week, how to grow beautiful roses. The keys to success with roses are, first of all, a sunny spot. Like many things that bloom and fruit, if you want blooms and fruit, you usually need sun, and roses do. At least 6 hours of sun for success. If you live in an older neighborhood and you just have too many beautiful shade trees that are creating a quite shady area, you may need to look at container-grown roses. There are varieties that do well that way, and you can put a container out where you have a little sunny spot, but perhaps not a good bed for planting roses. Roses also need to be regularly fed and watered because they need continual vigor and growth to do well. Our best varieties need to be fed and watered regularly to keep them productive. And third of all, you want to plant varieties that are recommended for the area. A local nursery or the extension office can provide suggestions for some of the best varieties to grow, the ones that do best here. Finally, disease control and pest control is important. If black spot or powdery mildew take away the foliage, they're not able to produce the sugars, which then in turn help the plant produce blooms. So plants that are struggling with disease and insect problems are just not going to be as blooming and productive. Good vigor with fertilizer and water and good pest control to protect that foliage, and you can have beautiful roses here in Central Texas. Our plant of the week is Jerusalem sage. Jerusalem sage blooms in the spring with beautiful bright yellow blooms. The foliage looks like sage, which is where it gets its name. It's not really a sage. It has a grayish type of foliage that's really quite attractive, even when the plant's not in bloom. Consider planting a Jerusalem sage in your garden this year. Things to do in the garden include fertilizing the lawn. By the time we reach tax day, mid-month, everyone can remember that day, it's time to get out and fertilize your lawn. The reason we wait this long is because the grass is actively growing now and can take up and use the fertilizer you apply. If you fertilize early, some of it will still be around for now, but the weeds will get a lot of it and some of it will wash away. And waiting a little later in the year is fine, but by now the grass can use the fertilizer. Remember to always fertilize moderately. We have guides at the extension office or on the Grow Green racks in nurseries where you can find out exactly how much fertilizer to apply. Don't think that if a little helps, a lot is better. A lot creates grass that is shallow rooted. You mow more, you water more, and it ends up turning the creek green too as the nitrogen washes off and helps contribute to algae problems in the creek. So fertilize moderately. It's time to feed those spring flowers. Things that have been blooming well tend to bloom themselves into a weak state, so continue to feed them to keep them productive. alternative. Your tomatoes need to be watered regularly and kept moist so that they don't get blossom end rot also. For more plant tips or to contact the Extension office in your county, visit klru.org/CTG.
Thanks, Skip. Now let's check in with John Dromgoole for Backyard Basics.
Hello, gardening friends. This year, I've met hundreds of new gardeners, more than hundreds really, maybe 1,000, I don't know. And these new gardeners are growing vegetables. There are a lot of good reasons to be growing vegetables these days. We never know what's going to happen to our food supply, and we can buffer it a little bit at least by growing vegetables, kind of like the old victory gardens. I like to call it a prosperity garden. So you're going out there with your new transplants right now, and you're putting them into the garden, and some of you have already planted. Well, there are some problems we're going to run into, so expect some problems in the garden. Not everybody will have them. But one of the ones that I run into probably more frequently than many of the insect problems during the season is blossom end rot on tomatoes. Now this has to do with the water in the soil fluctuating quite a bit, getting very dry and then real moist again. And so this uneven watering is what leads to this problem. It has a lot to do with the calcium in the soil, and the movement of calcium into a stressed plant puts it into the foliage and not the fruit, and the fruit needs it. So this stressing of going back and forth with the watering kind of throws the calcium out of balance. And so what happens? We get on the bottom of the fruit this soft brown spot, and that's the blossom end rot right there. If it gets a lesion in it, then some organisms get in there and it begins to rot. And so it's called blossom end rot. Well, you've got to manage this, and one of the best ways of doing this is to put a nice mulch on there. I like to use a pine straw mulch, and because later on in the season it works into the bed better than some of the hardwood mulches. So I'll use the pine straw out there. And so this will keep the moisture even in the soil, thus eliminating or certainly reducing this problem. A plant going in early and getting stressed may lead to this problem. So this whole cycle of planting is very important. Eggplants also get involved in this. Of course, the tomato is the big culprit. You'll see it on peppers and also some squash and watermelons. So this is something to be looking forward to in the garden unless you keep some even moisture out there. That's really, really important. Another problem that you might run into would be the squash vine borer. This is an ugly little creature that really can destroy the squash plant. But you take a knife, you open up the stem where it is, and remove this little critter. Now, one of the things that we like to do to prevent it is we build these hoop houses over the garden, and then we can put a screen on top of that. It's available in nurseries. It's a very lightweight screen, and that keeps the moth out of there that lays the eggs. We'll also use our white fabric that we use in the wintertime. But the key to this success is the bees need to pollinate the squash. So every day in the morning or in the evening, you need to open it up a little bit and allow the bees to get in there and do the pollinating for you. But it really does work. It does keep these squash vine borers off of there while that major first crop comes in. During the second crop, which I call the bee crop, it may occur, and that's when you'd be looking for it. So another one of the problems that's out there is if you're growing corn, it's the corn earworm borer. And this guy gets into the top of the corn. Organic gardeners are used to this, and we just cut the top of the corn off. But if you're surprised by this worm in there, you might prevent it by taking a little bit of the BT, the caterpillar killer, and squirting it into the top. I like to use an eyedropper and squirt it into the top of the corn, and that will get rid of the corn borer right away. There are some other things that you might find out there, like spider mites. This little guy causes the leaves on many plants to get kind of mottled with yellow spots, and the spider mite can be washed off of there. The other thing that you can do is use some seaweed in your sprayer and wash it off. If you do it once a week, you'll really reduce the spider mite problem. And so aphids are another one of these problems, but beneficial insects will do the job at managing these aphids. Now you want to make sure that you've got some ladybugs out there. And we recognize the ladybug. She's the poster child of the organic gardener. But at the juvenile stage, most of us don't recognize her. We may even think it's a harmful insect because it's next to the aphids. Well, these little guys are now doing their job better than the mature ladybug, and they're eating all of the aphids that are on the plant. So these are some of the kinds of things that you might be looking for this season. Maybe a fungicide out there for some of the foliar diseases that occur. Certainly use that seaweed to control spider mites and to nourish the plants and make them much more vigorous. And then there are some natural insecticides. If things are really out of balance and there's no beneficial insects there, then you might have to call on one of these. I like to avoid these, but sometimes it's necessary in that new garden. So for you new gardeners, you'll find some problems along the way. It may affect production, but I just showed you some great ways of managing these types of problems. For Backyard Basics, I'm John Dromgoole. I'll see you next time.
Check out klru.org/ctg for more tips, online video, and our weekly blog. Next week, we check out ground covers for sun and shade. Until then, I'll see you in the garden. Visit klru.org/ctg to learn more about today's program, upcoming events, and to sign up for our electronic newsletter. Check out John's how-to tips and visit Trish's Corner for ideas inside and out. Get growing at klru.org/ctg.